What's up, guys? Welcome to my home studio, me sitting in front of my bookshelf, and I'm doing something different today. I'm making a video on a plantation home that sits on private property, so I can't do my usual walk around. And it's Smithfield Plantation. It's in Spotsylvania County along the Rappahannock River. I'd say 2-3 miles southeast of Fredericksburg. And before I get started, I wanted to say if you've got an interest in Virginia history and you want to support the channel, you can like and subscribe. And the story of Smithfield dates back to 1666 when King Charles II granted 6,200 acres of land to a guy named Lawrence Smith. And just a few years later, he established a fort, that would be in 1675, along with Robert Taliaferro, pronounced Tolliver. That would be Robert the Immigrant Tolliver. And the Tollivers were one of Virginia's big first families, owned several plantation homes along the northern neck. Yeah, so they established the fort. Only lasted about 5 years before falling apart, and then Lawrence Smith partitioned the land into 2 parcels. Fast forward to 1730, one of the parcels was sold to Francis Tolliver. Francis Tolliver had passed the land on to his daughter, Anne Tolliver, and Anne Tolliver had married Richard Brooke. And the Brookes were a big family in Fredericksburg at that time. And they ended up building the plantation home. That would be 1753. Ended up naming it Smithfield in remembrance of Lawrence Smith, who was first granted the land. And they had several children. Their oldest son was a Lawrence Brooke, and he was a surgeon on the battleship with John Paul Jones during the Revolutionary War. John Paul Jones, another big Fredericksburg resident, lived on a house there at the corner of Caroline Street, right across from the train station. And as a matter of fact, Lawrence Brooke lived a little further down Caroline Street. He lived down Lower Caroline. If you want to take a look at his house, I did a video on Lower Caroline Street a couple months ago. And their second son was Robert Brooke. He was Virginia governor 1794 until 1796. And he ended up building the estate Federal Hill on top of Federal Hill in Fredericksburg. After that, they had 2 more sons. There would be a Francis and a John, both served in the Revolutionary War. They served under Marquis Lafayette, Alexander Spotswood, and that would be the grandson of the Alexander Spotswood. And after the war, they both became Virginia delegates. So the Brookes stayed in the house till about 1812, and in 1812, the house was sold to Robert Patton. And 4 generations later, they would produce General George Patton of World War II fame. So that's kind of crazy. And the Pattons only lived in the house for a couple of years. So in 1814, it was purchased by John Pratt Jr. And the Pratts another big family in the Fredericksburg area. Let's see, one time they owned Chatham Manor. They donated the land next door to become Pratt Park. Several medical facilities in the area named after them. And as a matter of fact, you can trace their lineage back to Charles Pratt, Earl of Camden. And anybody familiar with Baltimore will know the main road through town, Pratt Street. And of course, baseball stadium, Camden Yards, that's where it comes from, the Earl of Camden. And as a matter of fact, the Pratts also owned a plantation home down in Port Royal that they call Camden. So kind of interesting. And then somewhere around 1819, that first plantation home burned down. So that's when the current plantation home that you see was built. And that was completed 1822. After that, the house was passed on to a Thomas Pratt. He ended up dying 1861. So the house was then passed to William Carter Pratt. And actually, he's the one that owned the Camden Plantation down in Port Royal. So he lived at Camden Plantation, but he just owned Smithfield and just had it ran by a caretaker. And so at this time, of course, the Civil War kicked off. And the house saw a lot of action during the Battle of Fredericksburg. And it was occupied by Union forces. And as a matter of fact, they had broken through one of the windows to take possession of the house. They had that caretaker arrested. He was detained during the battle. Won't get too deep into the Civil War, but like I say, house saw a lot of action. There was artillery behind the house across the Rappahannock River, firing shells over the house. There was Confederate artillery on Prospect Hill about a mile in front of the house, firing shells back. As a matter of fact, Major John Pelham's famous assault early in the day of the battle, December 13th, 1862, the house was a target of much of his shelling. And then it's also the site of General Meade's advancement. He made his charge and he ended up breaking through Stonewall Jackson's line that started just about in front of the plantation home. So there's a big pyramid built in memorial. And the land where it sits was donated by the Pratts. So after the war, the house was used as a hospital. There were soldiers who wrote stories about piles of limbs stacked up. There were about 78 bodies buried on the grounds. And somewhere around 1867, 1868, the bodies were disinterred and they were taken over to the big Fredericksburg National Cemetery over there on Marie's Heights. So, yeah, then the Pratts ended up living in the house all the way until 1905. So they're in the house just about just a little more than 90 years. So then the house was purchased by a guy named Captain Conrad Vance. He was a successful banker, purchased the house in 1905. He had purchased the estate and some of the property of the adjoining plantation. Well, I guess it wasn't a plantation at that time, but that would have been Mansfield Plantation. So he ended up calling the whole thing Mansfield Farms, to be confusing, I guess. So, yeah, anyway, he made several upgrades. He added the columns out front. He added the wings to the side. Matter of fact, he used the same architect that had designed the Oval Office for William Howard Taft. So he lived in the home until he died in 1922, and he actually died in the big Knickerbocker storm. And there was a big blizzard up in Washington, D.C. at the Knickerbocker Theater, and the snow had collapsed the roof, killing 97 people. So yeah, Captain Vance passed away along with his wife. Several politicians died. Oh, and on a side note, the architect and the owner of the theater ended up committing suicide several years later. So yeah, the house then was sold, and in 1925 it was turned into the Mansfield Hall Country Club. And while it was the Mansfield Hall Country Club, it was visited by President Calvin Coolidge. He came down in 1928. He came down to dedicate the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania Military Park. And there were about 5,000 people in attendance, many descendants of Civil War generals. One of Robert E. Lee's descendants was there as well. And yeah, so the house stayed the Mansfield Hall Country Club until just after when it was sold, and then turned into the Fredericksburg Country Club in 1946, and that's kind of where we're at today. So anyway, that's my little spew on Smithfield Plantation, and yeah, hope I didn't do too bad. It's my first time in this format, and they'll get better in the future. Also wanted to throw out there, I know recently I've been spending a lot of time on the Battle of Fredericksburg. I'm just kind of just taking it easy for about a month here. But to let you know, I do have some big things in the works, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I guess that's it for this one, and see ya.